The city buzzed with its usual chaotic energy, people rushing past, cabs honking, and the distant hum of construction filling the air. Amid the rush, Emily walked with a purpose, her heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement. She was in her element, a successful career woman who had worked hard to leave her past behind. She had a meeting to attend, and nothing could distract her from the task ahead. Her mind raced with thoughts of numbers, deadlines, and deals as she navigated the familiar streets of downtown. The sunlight was beginning to fade, casting long shadows over sidewalks, giving the city an almost melancholic tone. But she barely noticed. Life had taught her to keep moving forward, never pausing long enough to look back. As she turned a corner onto the quieter part of the street, something caught her eye. A figure huddled against the side of a building, his form ragged and hunched. He looked like just another homeless man in the city, invisible to most. Her eyes grazed over him quickly, almost out of habit, until something made her stop. She froze in her tracks. There was something eerily familiar about the way he sat, something about the slope of his shoulders, the worn-out shoes, the tilt of his head. For a moment, the world seemed to close in around her, the sounds of the bustling city muffling as her pulse quickened. Emily's mind scrambled to make sense of it. She hadn't seen him in years, decades even. It couldn't be. And yet, her feet refused to move. She stood there, rooted in place, staring at the man who, at that moment, lifted his head. Their eyes met, and a jolt ran through her. It was him, her father. Memories she had long buried came flooding back, sharp and painful. She could almost hear the door slamming as he walked out of their lives for good when she was just a child. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained impassive, cold even. He looked at her with dull, sunken eyes, the life seemingly drained from him. There was no immediate sign of recognition on his part, just a blank stare that could have been meant for any stranger passing by. But she knew him. How could she not? Emily's legs trembled slightly as she took a hesitant step forward. Her heart screamed for her to walk away, to pretend she hadn't seen him. Yet, something stronger kept her standing there. She didn't know what to feel: anger, sadness, or pity. Maybe all of them at once. But as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. She forced herself to break eye contact, her body moving almost mechanically as she resumed her walk. Her heart still thundered in her chest as she hurried past, pretending that she hadn't just seen the ghost of her past sitting on the sidewalk, broken and destitute. The walk back to her apartment felt longer than usual. Each step was weighed down by memories she had tried so hard to forget. She hated herself for even stopping, for allowing him to affect her after all these years. Her father, the man who had walked out on them without a word, leaving her mother to pick up the pieces. The elevator doors slid open, and she stepped into her sleek, modern apartment. Everything about the space screamed success, control, and independence. The large windows overlooked the city skyline, and the minimalist decor reflected her perfectly ordered life. Emily had spent years building this, walling herself off from the emotional wreckage of her childhood. But now, all of it felt fragile, like it could shatter with a single touch. She sank into the plush couch, her head falling back as she stared at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, messages from friends, work emails. She ignored them all, her mind fixated on the face she had seen earlier. How had he ended up like that? What had driven him so low? Was he always like this after he left, or had life taken him down further? She remembered the nights when she and her mother would sit at the dinner table, staring at the empty chair where he once sat. Her mother, holding back tears, would say, "He'll be back, Em. He just needs time." But time stretched into years, and he never came back. Eventually, her mother stopped mentioning him altogether. That night, sleep evaded her. She tossed and turned, the image of her father's hollow, lifeless eyes haunting her. The next morning, she went through her usual routine: shower, coffee, breakfast, but everything felt off kilter, like she was operating in a daze. At work, her colleagues noticed her distraction. "Everything all right, Emily?" her assistant asked cautiously, but she brushed off their concern, plastering on a professional smile. Later that day, she found herself wandering back to the same street where she had seen him. Her stomach knotted with anticipation, unsure if she wanted to see him again. Maybe he wouldn't be there. Maybe she had imagined the whole thing. But as she approached the corner, there he was, sitting in the same spot, looking as defeated as ever. This time, she didn't hesitate. She walked right up to him, her heart pounding in her ears. Up close, he looked even worse. His clothes were torn, his hair matted, and a scruffy beard covered his gaunt face. "Do you remember me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at her, blinking slowly, as if struggling to process the question. A flicker of recognition flashed in his eyes, but it was fleeting. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Dad," she said louder this time. Her voice cracked, surprising even herself. The recognition in his eyes deepened, and his lips trembled. "Emily," he rasped, his voice hoarse and barely audible. A wave of emotion hit her, anger, sadness, and something she couldn't quite identify. She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but all she could do was stand there, feeling more lost than she had in years. She could see the guilt in his eyes, the weight of years of abandonment and regret, but words failed them both. Without saying another word, Emily turned and walked away, her heart heavy with the unresolved pain of their broken past. Emily spent the rest of the week trying to bury herself in work, hoping that the memory of her father would fade with time. But it didn't. Every time she walked the familiar route home, her eyes drifted toward the street corner where she had seen him. She told herself not to go back, that it was better to leave the past where it belonged, in the past. Yet, despite her best efforts, the pull was too strong. On Friday evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a golden glow over the city, she found herself standing once again at the corner. Her heart raced as she approached the familiar figure huddled against the building. He hadn't moved much since the last time she saw him. His frailty seemed to deepen with every passing day. This time, she didn't hesitate. She stood in front of him, her shadow falling over his form. He looked up slowly, squinting against the fading sunlight. His eyes met hers again, and this time, there was no question. He knew exactly who she was. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice low, trying to mask the tremor. She didn't know what she expected. An apology, an explanation, maybe even an excuse. But all she got was silence. His eyes were dull, sunken, and rimmed with dark circles, the kind that only years of hardship could carve. He didn't speak, just stared at her, his lips barely moving. She waited, feeling the tension in the air between them, thick and oppressive. "Do you remember me?" she asked again, though she already knew the answer. He had recognized her the last time, and she had seen it in his eyes. Still, she needed him to say it, to confirm that the man who had abandoned her family so many years ago was standing here now, destitute and broken. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The sound of her name, spoken in that familiar rasp, sent a chill down her spine. It had been so long since she had heard it from him, and now it felt foreign, like a word that didn't belong in his mouth. For a moment, she felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. How dare he? How dare he sit there, after all these years, and simply say her name like it was nothing, like their lives hadn't been torn apart by his absence. She clenched her fists, fighting the urge to lash out. But then she looked at him, really looked at him. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and gaunt, and his hands shook slightly as he sat there, helpless. Whatever anger she had been holding onto seemed to dissolve, replaced by something else. Pity, maybe, or sadness, or both. "I don't understand," she said quietly, almost to herself. "How did this happen?" He didn't answer. His lips moved, but no sound came out. It was as though he had forgotten how to speak, how to explain himself. Or maybe there was nothing to explain. Maybe life had simply crushed him, like it did so many others. Without thinking, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a $20 bill. She handed it to him, her hand trembling slightly. He stared at the money for a moment, his face expressionless, before shaking his head slowly. "No," he whispered, his voice strained. I don't need that." Emily's hand hovered in the air, unsure of what to do. She didn't know how to help him, didn't know if she even wanted to. But seeing him refuse her offer, even in his current state, struck something deep inside her. "I don't know what you need," she said softly, her voice tinged with frustration. "But I know I can't just leave you like this." Still, he refused the money, and without another word, he looked away, his eyes fixed on the ground as if retreating into himself. Emily stood there for a few more moments, feeling helpless and frustrated, before finally turning and walking away. Back in the comfort of her apartment, Emily paced the floor, the weight of the past few days hanging over her like a cloud. She had never imagined seeing her father again, much less like this. The last time she had seen him, she had been a little girl, watching him disappear out the door, leaving nothing but silence in his wake. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was Rachel, her best friend, asking if she wanted to grab drinks. Normally, Emily would have jumped at the chance to unwind, to forget about the stress of the week, but right now, she couldn't think of anything except the man she had left on the street. She ignored the message, sinking onto the couch instead, her mind racing. How had he ended up like that? What had happened in the years since he had abandoned her family? The questions swirled in her head, each one more confusing than the last. Unable to sit still, she grabbed her laptop and began searching. She typed his name into every search engine she could think of, combing through pages of irrelevant information, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain where he had been all these years. But there was nothing, no trace of him after the day he had left. It was as if he had disappeared off the face of the earth. Frustrated, Emily slammed the laptop shut. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, more to his sudden disappearance, his descent into homelessness. She had spent years convincing herself that he had simply walked away because he didn't care. But now, seeing him like this, she wasn't so sure. The next day, she called her mother. Her mother's voice was tired, worn from years of struggle. "Emily, it's been so long since we've talked," she said, the subtle note of sadness always present. Emily wasn't in the mood for small talk. She needed answers. "Mom, what really happened when Dad left?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Emily could almost hear her mother's breath catch, as if the weight of that question had been too much to bear after all these years. "Why are you asking now?" her mother asked cautiously. "You've never wanted to talk about him before." Emily bit her lip. How could she explain what had happened without stirring up old wounds? "I saw him," she said finally, the words falling from her mouth before she could stop them. "He's homeless, on the street." The silence on the other end of the line stretched on for what felt like an eternity. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Emily, I don't know what happened to him after he left. I stopped wondering a long time ago, but there has to be more to it," Emily pressed, the desperation creeping into her voice. "People don't just disappear like that." Her mother sighed. "People change, Emily. They make choices, and sometimes those choices lead them down paths we can't understand." Emily wasn't satisfied with that answer. She needed to know why her father had left, why he had abandoned them. But she could hear the exhaustion in her mother's voice, and she knew pushing further wouldn't get her anywhere. They hung up, and Emily sat in the quiet of her apartment, the weight of silence pressing down on her. She had spent so many years trying to forget her father, to move on with her life. But now, it felt like the past was dragging her backward, pulling her into the very thing she had worked so hard to escape. The next few days passed in a blur, but Emily couldn't stop thinking about her father. She replayed their brief encounters in her mind, analyzing every moment, every word, though there had been so few spoken between them. What had happened to him after he left? How had he ended up like this? On a cold, gray afternoon, she found herself walking down the same street again, as if drawn there by some invisible force. She hadn't planned it, but somehow, she knew she had to see him again. She needed answers. When she reached the corner, her father was there, hunched over as usual, his eyes distant and unfocused. His frail body seemed even more shrunken against the cold wind. Emily stood in front of him, waiting for him to look up, to acknowledge her presence. This time, she wouldn't walk away without confronting him. "Why did you leave us?" The question spilled out of her before she could stop it, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond at first. His eyes moved slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep, and finally settled on her. There was recognition in his gaze, but it was mixed with something else, shame perhaps. "Emily," he murmured, but the words didn't come easily. His voice was raspy, weak, like it had been too long since he'd spoken to anyone. "You left us," she repeated, her voice louder this time, demanding an answer. "Do you know what that did to us? To Mom, to me." His head drooped, and for a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. The weight of the years between them hung heavy in the air. I didn't mean to hurt you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought it would be better if I wasn't there." Emily's heart clenched at his words. Better? How could it have been better? She had grown up without a father, watched her mother struggle to keep their lives together, and felt the sting of abandonment every day. "You thought it was better to disappear?" she asked, her voice sharp with pain. "You thought that would make our lives easier?" He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the ground. His hands, worn and calloused, trembled slightly as he clutched the edge of the dirty blanket draped over his lap. "I was broken," he said softly. "I couldn't be the father you needed. I thought if I left, you'd be better off without me." His words hung in the air, a twisted logic that didn't make sense to Emily. But as she stood there, staring at the broken man before her, she realized that in his own way, he had believed it. He had believed that walking away was the only option, even if it had destroyed everything. "I didn't need you to be perfect," Emily said quietly. "I just needed you to be there." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't cry in front of him, not now. She had spent years learning to be strong, to not let the pain of his absence define her. But standing here, face to face with him, it all came rushing back. Her father said nothing. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they had never said, all the years they had lost. Finally, Emily turned away. She couldn't stand there any longer. She had asked her question, and while his answer didn't fix anything, it was enough for now. As she walked away, she felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward understanding. That night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what her father had said. His words echoed in her mind, bringing up memories she had long buried. He had been broken, but what had broken him? There had to be more to the story, something she didn't know, something her mother had never told her. The next day, she made a decision. She was going to find out the truth. She called her aunt, her father's sister, whom she hadn't spoken to in years. They had drifted apart after her father left, and her aunt had never been particularly close with the rest of the family. But now, Emily needed answers. When her aunt picked up the phone, her voice was cautious, as if she wasn't sure why Emily was calling after all this time. "Hi, Aunt Laura," Emily began, trying to keep her voice steady. "I wanted to ask you about Dad." There was a pause on the other end, and Emily could almost hear her aunt's hesitation. "Your father?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "What about him?" "I saw him," Emily said, her heart pounding. He's homeless. I found him on the street." Her aunt's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "Oh, Emily," she murmured, her voice soft with sympathy. "I had no idea." "I need know why he left," Emily said, her voice firmer now. "Mom never told me the whole story, and I feel like there's something I'm missing." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Emily could feel the tension building, the weight of the secrets her family had kept from her. "Your father," Aunt Laura began, her voice hesitant. "He wasn't well, Emily. He had problems. Things that none of us really understood at the time." "What kind of problems?" Emily asked, her pulse quickening. "Depression," Aunt Laura said softly. "He was struggling for years before he left. He tried to hide it, try to keep going, but it got worse. After he lost his job, it all fell apart. Emily's heart sank. Depression. It wasn't something she had ever associated with her father. He had always seemed so strong, so capable. But hearing the word now, it made sense. She remembered the way he had withdrawn in the months before he left, how he had become distant, almost like a stranger in their own home. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know how," Aunt Laura said. "And your mother?" "Well, she didn't want you to think badly of him. She thought it was easier to tell you that he left because he didn't care." Emily's mind raced, trying to process this new information. Her father hadn't left because he didn't love them. He had left because he was broken, struggling with something he didn't know how to handle. "Did he ever try to get help?" Emily asked. "He did, at first," Aunt Laura said, "but he didn't stick with it. After he lost his job, he just gave up. He didn't think he was worth saving." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent years hating him, resenting him for abandoning them, and now she was learning that he had been battling demons she had never even known about. "I wish someone had told me," Emily said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm sorry, Emily," Aunt Laura said softly. "We thought we were protecting you, but maybe we were wrong." After they hung up, Emily sat in silence, the weight of the new information settling over her. Her father had been broken, but not in the way she had thought. He hadn't walked away because he didn't care. He had left because he didn't know how to stay. It didn't make the pain of his abandonment any less real, but it gave her a new perspective. For the first time, she began to see him not just as the man who had left, but as a man who had been hurting, who had been lost. The next time Emily visited the street corner where her father sat, the familiar nervousness gripped her, but something had changed. The anger that had once fueled her encounters with him was now replaced with a fragile sense of understanding. She still felt hurt, but there was a new layer of empathy underneath. When she approached him this time, her steps were less hesitant. Her father was slumped in the same position, his body barely reacting to the cold breeze that whipped through the city streets. Emily stopped in front of him, and for the first time, she saw him not as the man who had abandoned her, but as someone who had been lost, struggling, and in pain. "Dad," she said softly, the words slipping out more naturally than she had expected. His head lifted, his eyes finding hers. There was no surprise in his expression this time, just a tired resignation, as if he had expected her to walk away from him once again. But she didn't. She crouched down beside him, her eyes level with his. "I've been thinking about what you said," Emily began, her voice steady. "About why you left. I'm still angry. I still don't understand everything, but I want to—" Her father blinked slowly, his brow furrowing slightly. He looked at her as though he couldn't quite believe she was there, offering him another chance. "I don't deserve it," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I never deserved to be your father." Emily felt her heart ache at his words. There was so much pain in his voice, so much self-loathing. She had spent years hating him, and now she realized that he had been hating himself all along. "I'm not here to tell you what you deserve," she said quietly. "I'm here because I don't want to keep carrying this anger anymore. I don't know how to fix things, but I want to try." Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Finally, he nodded slowly, his hands trembling as they rested on his lap. "I don't know how to start," he whispered. "Neither do I," Emily admitted, a small, sad smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But we can figure it out together." She wasn't sure what would happen next. She didn't have a plan, didn't know if she could ever fully forgive him. But for the first time in years, she felt like they were taking a step towards something, maybe not reconciliation, but at least understanding. As the evening darkened around them, Emily stayed by his side. They didn't talk much, and that was okay. For now, just being there was enough. Days passed, and Emily found herself visiting her father more frequently. Each visit was tentative, like they were both afraid to break the fragile connection they had begun to rebuild. The conversations were brief, often awkward, but they were talking, and that was more than they had done in years. One cold afternoon, Emily brought him a hot coffee and a sandwich. Her father accepted it with a quiet "thank you," his hands still shaking as he took the cup. He hadn't refused her offers of food since that first time, but there was always a look in his eyes that made her wonder if he felt ashamed for needing it. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Emily asked as she sat beside him on the bench. She had never asked him directly about his situation, unsure if she was ready to hear the answer. He shook his head, taking a sip of the coffee before replying. "No, nowhere," he said softly. "Not anymore." Emily's chest tightened at his words. She had known, of course, that he was living on the streets, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel more real. "What happened after you left?" she asked quietly, the question hanging in the cold air between them. It was the first time she had asked him directly about his life after he had walked out of theirs. Her father's hands tightened around the cup, his eyes fixed on the ground in front of him. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that the weight of his past was too heavy to share. "I tried," he said after a long pause, his voice low and filled with regret. "I tried to make things right, but after I left, everything fell apart. I lost my job, my house, everything." Emily listened silently, her heart aching with each word. She had imagined so many different scenarios over the years, wondering what had happened to him, but hearing the reality was worse than she had expected. "I thought I could handle it," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I couldn't. I couldn't face you or your mother after what I'd done. So I kept running, and eventually I had nothing left to run to." His words were raw, filled with years of guilt and shame. Emily sat quietly, letting him speak, letting him finally release the burden he had been carrying for so long. "I wanted to come back," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to, but I didn't know how. I didn't think you'd want me." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. For so many years, she had resented him for leaving, but now she saw that he had been punishing himself just as much as she had. His guilt had kept him away, had stopped him from trying to make amends. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Emily said softly, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "But I want to try." Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I don't expect you to," he said quietly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "I'm not sure forgiveness is about what someone deserves," Emily replied. "It's about letting go of the pain." They sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of the years between them heavy, but no longer unbearable. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward healing. The strain of the past few weeks began to take its toll on Emily. Her visits to her father were becoming more frequent, and though they were slowly rebuilding some semblance of a relationship, the weight of it all was starting to affect other parts of her life. Her mind was constantly occupied with thoughts of him, his frailty, his guilt, his unspoken hope for redemption. But as much as she wanted to help him, it was draining her emotionally. At work, her colleagues noticed her distraction. The once efficient, quick-witted Emily was now slower to respond to emails, missed a few deadlines, and seemed perpetually distant. Rachel, her best friend and coworker, approached her one afternoon as they shared a quiet moment in the break room. "You've been off lately," Rachel said, her voice tinged with concern. "What's going on?" Emily hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about finding her father, not even Rachel. It felt too raw, too personal, and she wasn't ready to face the inevitable questions. But now, with everything feeling like it was spiraling out of control, she knew she couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. "I found my dad," Emily said quietly, her eyes fixed on the coffee mug in her hands. Rachel blinked in surprise. "Your dad? But didn't he leave?" "Yes. He left years ago," Emily said, cutting her off gently. "But I found him. He's homeless. I've been trying to help him." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything Emily had been carrying alone. Rachel's face softened with sympathy. "Emily, why didn't you tell me? That's a lot to deal with on your own." "I didn't know how," Emily admitted. "It's complicated. I'm not even sure if I'm doing the right thing. Some days, it feels like I'm helping him, but other days, I don't know. It feels like everything is falling apart." Rachel reached across the table and squeezed Emily's hand. "You're doing what you can. That's all anyone can ask. But don't lose yourself in trying to fix him." Those words lingered in Emily's mind long after their conversation ended. Don't lose yourself. But that's exactly what it felt like. Like she was losing herself in her father's brokenness, in his guilt, and in her unresolved anger. She had worked so hard to build a life for herself, and now it felt like that life was unraveling. When she visited her father that evening, the usual sense of purpose that had driven her to keep coming back was dulled. She handed him a sandwich and sat beside him, but her heart wasn't in it. The burden of his existence weighed on her more than ever. Her father must have sensed it because he glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said quietly, his voice filled with the same guilt that had been there from the start. Emily shook her head, trying to push the feeling away. "I want to," but even as she said the words, she wasn't sure if they were true. Days turned into weeks, and Emily continued her visits, though the emotional toll grew heavier with each passing day. She felt stuck in a limbo, torn between her sense of duty toward her father and the feeling that her own life was slipping through her fingers. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting day at work, she visited her father again. The air was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and stayed there. Her father sat in his usual spot, but something about him seemed different. There was a stillness, a quietness that unsettled her. As she approached, she noticed that he was holding something in his hands, a small worn-out book. His fingers traced the edges of the pages absent-mindedly, and for the first time, Emily saw a faint smile on his face. "What's that?" she asked, sitting down beside him. Her father glanced at her, the smile fading slightly as he handed her the book. It was an old journal, the cover faded and the edges frayed. Emily opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting on the yellowed pages. It was her mother's journal. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she flipped through the pages, recognizing the entries from years ago. Entries about her, about their family, and about her father. "I found it," her father said quietly, "in one of the boxes I kept before everything fell apart." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she read through the entries. Her mother had written about their struggles, about her love for Emily, and about her own pain. But what struck Emily the most was the way her mother had written about her father. The anger she had always assumed her mother carried wasn't there. Instead, the journal was filled with words of sadness, of longing, and, most surprisingly, of hope. "She loved you," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Her father nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know how to be what she needed. I didn't know how to be what you needed." For the first time, Emily saw her father not just as the man who had left, but as someone who had been deeply loved by her mother. The anger she had held onto for so long began to shift, replaced by something softer, something more painful: understanding. "I thought she hated you," Emily said, her voice cracking. "I thought you left because you didn't love us." Her father shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "I left because I thought you'd be better off without me. I was wrong. I've been wrong about so many things." The journal felt heavy in Emily's hands, like it held the weight of all the years they had lost. She closed it carefully, her mind racing with everything she had just read. Her mother had loved her father, even after he had left. She had hoped, somehow, that he would come back. And now, all these years later, Emily realized that her own anger had kept her from seeing the full picture. "I don't know how to move forward from this," Emily admitted, her voice shaking with emotion. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I think I understand now." Her father nodded slowly, his eyes filled with the same mix of regret and gratitude that had been there since the beginning. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he said quietly. "I just want you to know that I'm sorry." Emily sat beside him, the journal resting in her lap, and for the first time since she had found him on the street, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something else. Understanding, maybe, or healing. They sat in silence as the night crept in around them, the weight of the past finally starting to lift, if only just a little. The revelations from her mother's journal lingered with Emily long after she left her father that evening. It was as if the pages of that worn book had unlocked a new understanding of the past, but it also brought a new layer of complexity to the situation. She still wasn't sure how to move forward, but she knew she couldn't continue avoiding the hard decisions that lay ahead. One cold morning, Emily sat in her apartment, staring out at the city skyline. Her thoughts churned like the gray clouds above. She had reached a crossroads, and there was no denying it anymore. Her father was growing weaker, his body frailer with each passing day. His time on the streets was wearing him down, and she knew that if she didn't intervene soon, the consequences could be irreversible. Emily had been trying to balance her visits with him and her work, but it was becoming harder. Every day felt like she was sacrificing a part of herself, her career, her friendships, and her emotional well-being. But none of it compared to the sacrifice she now considered making. She couldn't leave him on the streets any longer. But taking him into her home, that was a commitment she wasn't sure she was ready for. The idea had been forming in her mind for days, but she had pushed it away, afraid of what it would mean. Letting him into her life in that way, giving him shelter, it felt like more than she could handle. Yet, each time she visited him, the thought grew louder, more insistent. Could she really turn away now? Could she leave him to fend for himself, knowing that he had no one else? Emily sighed, leaning back in her chair. She didn't know if she could handle the emotional weight of having her father so close, especially with all the unresolved pain between them. But the alternative, leaving him to waste away on the streets, was something she couldn't live with. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Rachel, checking in on her again. Emily hadn't responded much over the last few days, too consumed with everything happening with her father. But now, she felt the need to talk to someone, to get a second opinion. She called Rachel, and after a few rings, her friend picked up. "Emily, I was just thinking about you," Rachel said, her voice warm with concern. "How are you holding up?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I don't know, Rach. I'm thinking about bringing my dad to stay with me. I can't leave him out there anymore, but I'm scared it's going to be too much." Rachel was silent for a moment, and Emily could almost hear her processing the situation. "That's a big step," she said gently. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I don't know," Emily admitted, "but I feel like I don't have a choice. If I don't do something now, he might not make it through the winter." Rachel's voice softened with understanding. "You're doing a good thing, Em, but make sure you're taking care of yourself, too. You've already sacrificed so much." Emily swallowed hard. She knew Rachel was right. She had given up a lot for her father already. But this was different. This was opening a door she wasn't sure she could close again. "Thanks, Rach," Emily said quietly. "I'll figure out." After they hung up, Emily sat in silence, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She knew what she had to do, even if it scared her. That evening, Emily approached her father as she always did, but this time, there was a different kind of urgency in her steps. He was sitting on the same bench, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his threadbare jacket around him. The cold was setting in, and it showed in his pale, gaunt face. "Dad," she said softly, sitting beside him. "I've been thinking, you can't stay out here anymore." He glanced at her, his eyes weary. "I don't have anywhere else to go," he said quietly, as if the reality of his situation had long since settled in his mind. "I know," Emily replied, her voice firmer now. "That's why I want you to come stay with me, at least for a while, until we can figure something out." Her father looked at her, surprise flashing in his tired eyes. "Emily, I can't. I don't want to be a burden." "You won't be," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure if she believed herself. "We'll take it one day at a time." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. His gaze dropped to the ground, and Emily could see the conflict in his expression, the shame of accepting her offer, mixed with the desperation to survive. Finally, he nodded, his voice hoarse as he whispered, "Thank you." The first few days of having her father stay in her apartment were tense, to say the least. Emily had prepared herself for the challenges, But the reality of it was harder than she expected. Her father was quiet, keeping mostly to himself, but the awkwardness between them hung in the air, thick and palpable. Her apartment, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt cramped with the presence of someone else, someone who carried the weight of her past with him. She had rearranged a guest room for him, made sure he had clean clothes and enough food, but beyond that, she wasn't sure what to do. Each evening, they shared a quiet dinner together, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. Sometimes, Emily would catch him looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and guilt, as if he still couldn't believe she had taken him in. One night, after a particularly long day at work, Emily sat down across from her father at the small kitchen table. She watched him as he slowly ate his meal, his hands still shaking slightly from the cold that had settled into his bones. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice gentle. He glanced up at her, his eyes tired but warm. "Better," he said softly. "Thank you, Emily. I don't know what I would have done without you." Emily's chest tightened at his words. She had been waiting for this, for him to acknowledge what she had sacrificed, what she had done for him. But now that he had said it, she didn't know how to respond. "I'm just glad you're safe," she said, her voice catching slightly. Her father nodded, his gaze dropping back to his plate. "I'm sorry," he whispered after a long pause. "For everything. For leaving. For all the years I wasn't there." Emily's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice. She had spent so long carrying the anger and resentment from his absence. But now, sitting across from him, she realized how much he had suffered too. The guilt had eaten away at him, just as the pain had eaten away at her. "I know," she said quietly, her eyes filling with tears. "And I'm trying to let go of the anger." For the first time, her father reached across the table, his hand trembling as it touched hers. "You've done more for me than I ever deserved," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never be able to make up for the past, but I'm grateful for this chance." Emily squeezed his hand gently, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't know if things would ever be fully mended between them, but she knew that they were taking steps toward healing, towards something better. In the days that followed, they continued to rebuild, slowly but surely. Her father started helping around the apartment, cleaning up and making small repairs where he could. Emily began to see glimpses of the man he once was, the man her mother had loved, the man she had missed for so long. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, moments when the weight of their shared history threatened to pull them back into the darkness. But those moments were becoming less frequent, and in their place, something new was beginning to grow. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was something close. And for now, that was enough. As the weeks passed, Emily and her father settled into an uneasy routine. There were still moments when the weight of their history pressed down on them, but for the most part, they had begun to find a fragile peace in their shared space. Emily knew, however, that the calm wouldn't last forever. There were still unresolved truths between them, truths that would eventually need to be confronted. One evening, as they sat in the living room, her father broke the silence. "Emily," he began, his voice hesitant, "there's something I need to tell you." Emily looked up from the book she had been reading, her heart quickening at his tone. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the final pieces of the past would be laid bare. Her father sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I never told you the full truth about why I left." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had thought she already knew his guilt, his depression, his belief that he wasn't good enough to be her father. But as she looked at him now, she realized there was more. There had always been more. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, setting the book aside. Her father stared at the floor, his hands clasped tightly together. "I left because I was scared," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But it wasn't just about me feeling like I wasn't good enough. It was because I did something that I couldn't forgive myself for." Emily's chest tightened as she waited for him to continue. "I made a mistake at work," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A big one. I was working on a project, something that involved a lot of money. I miscalculated. It cost the company millions. They fired me. I was humiliated. And I thought if I told your mother, it would ruin everything. Emily felt her heart sink. She had always assumed his departure was rooted in personal failure, but now she understood. It had been more than that. It had been about fear, shame, and the belief that he could never come back from the mistakes he had made. I thought running away would be easier, her father continued, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know how to face the people I had let down. Your mother, you. I thought leaving would be the only way to protect you from my failure. Emily sat in stunned silence. Her mind raced, trying to process this new information. She had spent so many years believing that her father had left because he didn't care, but now she realized that his actions had been driven by fear, not of her or her mother, but of himself. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry, Emily. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She had never expected this final piece of the puzzle that explained so much, yet made everything even more complicated. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The weight of his confession hung between them, heavy and oppressive. Finally, Emily took a deep breath, her voice shaky as she spoke. I wish you had told me sooner, she said quietly. But I understand now. I understand why you left. Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. I wish I had been brave enough to stay, he said softly. I wish I could go back and fix it all. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wasn't ready to forgive him completely, not yet, but hearing the truth, the full truth, was a step forward. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, she said honestly. But I'm trying, and I think that's all we can do right now. Try. Her father nodded slowly, his face etched with sorrow. I'll keep trying too, he promised. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the tension between them finally easing as the truth settled into place. It wasn't the closure Emily had imagined, but it was a beginning, one she could build on. The days that followed were marked by a quiet, almost unspoken understanding between Emily and her father. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when the past felt too close for comfort, but something had shifted. They had confronted the darkest part of their shared history, and in doing so, they had taken a step toward healing. Emily found herself looking at her father differently now. He wasn't just a man who had left. He was a man who had made mistakes, who had been broken by life's pressures, but who was also trying, in his own way, to make amends. It didn't erase the pain of his absence, but helped her see him as human, flawed, but worthy of the chance to rebuild. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, her father spoke up. I've been thinking, he said, his voice tentative. I can't stay here forever. I don't want to keep depending on you like this. Emily looked at him, surprised. She had been so focused on trying to help him, to offer him a safe place to recover, that she hadn't considered what the next step might be. The idea of him leaving filled her with a strange mixture of relief and sadness. You don't have to go yet, she said, her voice softer than she intended. I know, he replied, his gaze meeting hers. But I want to, I need to find my own way again, as much as I can. I can't keep relying on you to fix everything. Emily felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had spent so much time trying to make up for the years they had lost. And now, hearing him say he wanted to stand on his own, she realized that this was what she had wanted for him all along, to find his own strength again. Where will you go? She asked quietly. I've been looking into some shelters, he said, his voice steady. There are programs that can help me get back on my feet, help me find work, maybe even a place to live eventually. Emily's heart ached at the thought of him leaving, but she knew he was right. He couldn't stay with her forever, and as much as she wanted to protect him, he needed to find his own path. I think that's a good idea, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But you'll still come see me, right? Her father smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Of course, he said. I'm not going to disappear again. I promise. Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness wash over her. It wasn't goodbye, not really. It was just another step in their journey, a step toward independence for both of them. A week later, her father moved into a transitional shelter. It was a small, simple place, but it offered the support he needed to start rebuilding his life. Emily visited him regularly, bringing him small comforts from home, his favorite books, warm clothes, little things that made the place feel less impersonal. Each time she visited, she saw small changes in him. He was gaining weight, his face no longer gaunt from malnourishment. He spoke more openly, with a renewed sense of hope in his voice. And slowly, she felt her own heart begin to heal as well. One day, as they sat in the small common room of the shelter, her father turned to her, his expression serious. "Emily, I want you to know how much this means to me," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful every day for the chance you've given me." Emily smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've earned it, Dad," she said. "We're both learning to move forward." It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the past threatened to overshadow the progress they had made. But as Emily sat beside her father, she realized that they had both come a long way. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to grow from it, and to find hope in the spaces between the scars. And for the first time in years, Emily felt like they were both moving forward, together. Hey, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. We'd love to know what part of the story had the biggest impact on you. Was it the emotional journey, the unexpected revelations, or something else? Let us know in the comments. And while you're there, feel free to share any suggestions for stories you'd like to see next on the channel. Your input means everything to us, and we can't wait to bring you more incredible tales.